Hi, and welcome to Ones and Tooze, FP's economics podcast. Every week we take a couple data points, use them to try to explain the world. I'm Cameron Abadi, FP's deputy editor, with you in Berlin, Germany. Joining me in Berlin, but not in the same room, is FP's economics columnist and Columbia University professor, Adam Tooze. Hi, Adam.
Hi, Cam.
So, two topics for you all this week. The second half of the show, we'll be talking about the economics of Alaska, which is the site of the summit between Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin. We won't be able to cover the outcomes of that summit, given that we're recording this the day before the summit, but we thought discussing the economics of the state where it's taking place could be an interesting and oblique way into the events there on Friday. But first, we wanted to give you another data point, and that is 1.3 million, which is the number of seeds currently at the Svalbard Global Seed Vault. That's basically a Doomsday vault of seeds that is near the North Pole. And that sounds like something I might be making up, but it is in fact very real.
If you believe the media hype, then the Svalbard Global Seed Vault is preparation for Doomsday.
800 miles from the North Pole, the Global Seed Vault holds emergency stockpiles of most of the world's crops. It provides scientists with the tools they need to breed plants.
You can hear more about this seed vault, in fact, by listening to another podcast that our production team worked on. It's called State of Seed, and you can check it out already wherever you get your podcasts. It's hosted by our former producer, Laura Rossbrow-Tellem, produced by our own producer of this podcast, Claudia Tatey. Adam and I would totally recommend checking it out, not least because the subject struck us as so fascinating. Seeds. It's all about seeds, which are a major economic factor of their own in all sorts of dimensions. And we thought we'd kind of try to unpack that a little bit. And again, if you're interested, you can check out that other podcast, State of Seed. But yeah, first off, Adam, I want to get to Svalbard, this particular vault of seeds, but I wanted to first ask about kind of the theory of seed banks of this sort to begin with. You know, they're designed to kind of guard against a kind of catastrophe, but yeah, what kind of catastrophe do the producers and maintainers of these kinds of vaults have in mind?
Yeah, I'm really glad we're doing this episode. I was immediately excited when I heard that Laura was doing this seeds show, and I really think we ought to do like a regular harvest segment on Ones and Twos where we look at like the world's crops and see how everything's turned out this year. It's really a fascinating dimension. So seed banks are basically depositories for genetic diversity of plant life, on which we of course all depend to survive as humans. And there's about 1,750 of them worldwide. Svalbard is the pinnacle. We'll say more about it in a minute. It's like the reserve bank of seed banks. Its immediate undergirding is a thing called the CGIAR network, which consists of regionally specialized seed banks covering key global crops. So in the Philippines, there's one that covers rice varieties. In Mexico, where so much comes from hereditary-wise, there's one that covers maize and wheat. In Morocco and Lebanon, it used to be. In Syria, there's a seed bank that covers dry land crops like barley, wheat, lentils, and so on. So you go around the world, there's a battery of these, like a sort of squad of those, and they then feed their seeds, we'll say this and more about this in a minute, into the Svalbard system. And these things are, one shouldn't imagine them as gigantic centers. They're not hugely expensive. The entire global network of CGIAR has a budget of about 30 million. There are national centers as well. So the United States has a national center for genetic resource preservation. That has a budget of a couple of $1 million. Don't tell Elon Musk, they'll decide it's irrelevant and scrap it. And what they are is basically insurance. And like you're saying, they're insurance against the possibility of something really terrible happening. And that could be something short-term or it could be something long-term. So it could be a natural disaster. So in a major cyclone in Myanmar destroyed most of the national seed reserve, and so they were resupplied from the global seed system. It could be about ensuring that we have adequate diversity in crops so as to avoid the kind of 1840s potato famine that swept all of Northern Europe, most notoriously, of course, Ireland. It could be man-made disasters, wars where we need to replenish the agricultural resources. So in the case of the Syrian civil war, the North African seed banks scrambled to preserve the agricultural heritage of one of the oldest agricultural regions in the world. Or we could be dealing with really long-term threats like climate change or the growing impact of commercial agriculture, which has a huge commercial interest in winnowing down and minimizing the diversity of the crop. And these different scenarios are what the seed banks are all designed to shield against. And given their costs, like, I'm for them. We should have more. Like, these are like, it seems like such a no-brainer. If you can preserve, basic elements of the world's genetic variety for peanuts, like, the cost of a large apartment in New York, like, it's time to do that.
Yeah, the seed banks, as you're saying, have proliferated around the world, and Svalbard is one example of them. But there's a longer history of these seed banks, including an early seed bank that was founded in the Soviet Union. I'm curious if you could tell us how that got started, and it actually resulted in tragedy of a sort. So, yeah, could you explain what happened there?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's not just an example. I think it's the granddaddy, it's the originator of the very idea. It's this guy, this extraordinary, heroic Russian biologist, plant scientist, early geneticist Nikolai Vavilov, who was born in the late 19th century in Tsarist Russia and witnessed firsthand the devastating effects of famine. Hundreds of thousands of people dying in droughts, in various other types of agricultural disaster in his childhood. And he conceived the extraordinary idea that to develop more hardy crops, the crucial thing was to breed, fast-growing, high-yield commercial crop varieties with wild strains which were more resistant to insects, to disease, to drought, to salination, and so on. And so set off on a personal mission to collect all of the seeds of all of the world, which is ultimately the seed banking idea, right? It's like a giant library. So it comes from that kind of earlier era of information economics, and traveled the world. He was an extraordinary adventurous figure, made over 100 expeditions to 64 countries, and personally collected 380,000 samples, which, given the factoid that we started with, like, this one guy came into the ballpark of the kind of total archive of genetic variety that we aspire to now at the global level. And in the way of the early Soviet Union, which was a truly kind of inspired zone of experimentation, the Soviet regime said, oh yeah, fine, have at it. Built a large institute for him in Leningrad, and you can see the note of tragedy creeping in here. And by the late 30s, Vavilov had a huge industrial-scale agronomical project going with tens of thousands of workers across the Soviet Union, because they didn't just collect the seeds, they then planted them in the huge expanse of the Soviet state and were able to experiment with them. So it wasn't just a pure archiving activity, it was the largest plant science project hitherto undertaking. And this being the Soviet Union, this being the late 30s, and this talking about Leningrad, I think you know where the story goes next. I mean, Vavilov falls foul of the grim, anti-geneticist Lysenko, the kind of fanatical Stalinist scientists, and he is arrested and ends up in a gulag. And that's in 1940. And then shortly afterwards, in June 41, the German army invades the Soviet Union, and Leningrad is placed under siege. And the truly extraordinary drama ensues in which this team of plant scientists assembled by Vavilov face the reality of a starving city of hundreds of thousands of people desperately hungry around them. And they're sitting on one of the largest collections of rare grain in the world. And every single one of them takes the decision that they would first, preserve the seed stock for posterity and for humanity, and secondly, sacrifice themselves rather than pilfer the seed reserves so as to stay alive. And several of the scientists working in the laboratory die in the course of the siege. One of them, at least, with a seed sample in his hand, demonstrating his refusal to sacrifice this scientific project to his own personal survival. Vavilov himself is tortured and ultimately starved to death in the Gulag system by the henchmen of the Stalinist security apparatus. But the system is rebuilt after the war, and the seed archive largely survived. So its legacy lives on, and it's still one of the largest components of the global seed bank system. But it's a truly graphic demonstration of how science and knowledge are interwoven with power and horror in the 20th century.
Yeah, I'm not even sure how to make that calculation. Obviously, so many died in Leningrad in that kind of siege of the sort that we discussed last week in talking about Gaza. And yeah, there's a benefit to future posterity, but to make those calculations about dying in the present for some future benefit, I guess that is part of politics, and harrowing to think that they actually had to make those decisions at that time. But this history of seed banks, which started there, as now continues to the present, and as we mentioned, there's now this kind of global seed bank in the North Pole by the name of Svalbard, the Global Seed Vault. I'm curious how that has been managed and maintained. I mean, as a project, how exactly has this gotten started, and what keeps it going?
Well, I mean, one of the things about it that's really interesting is it's built disaster-proof, so it needs the least amount of maintaining possible. So one of the reasons it's in the far north is that it's in the permafrost, and so you don't even need to maintain the electricity supply to keep the seeds at a very low temperature, right? So it's actually sort of designed to be relatively hands-off. What I also didn't understand about it is that it's really a bank. I mean, it's like, the sequence in the film where, I don't know, like the hero goes into the bank and has the key to a safe deposit box, and the bank attendant take them in there and then discreetly back out of the vault whilst the hero waits for privacy and then opens it. Like the people who deposit seeds in the Svalbard seed bank retain what's called seed sovereignty. No one else is allowed to open their vault, right? So it's literally a sort of safe deposit zone for seed deposits. Norway isn't claiming, and the organization that runs it is not claiming power over these seeds. It's simply saying, if you're in the business of holding seeds, we're in the business of backing you up with a reserve depository. It's really extraordinary. What maintains this infrastructure is a structure of science and nutrition that was built globally, starting with the Green Revolution in the 60s, and then built out from there. So it started with this CGIAR consortium of seed banks, which began to take shape informally in the 1970s. By the 80s, there was some idea that this needed to be coordinated. By the 90s and the 2000s, this is beginning to be organized. And then, of course, as you'd expect, the usual suspects get involved. The Gates Foundation, Monsanto, the big corporates in the early 2000s realize they have a stake in global governance. It's a bit like global health with, mosquito netting and HIV medication. There is genuinely, in that moment of globalism in the early 2000s, a kind of rallying of corporate interests around global governance projects. And it's out of that the originally, more public Green Revolution orientated science of the 60s and 70s gets morphed into this rather James Bond, Batman's lair kind of vision of the last redoubt of genetic biodiversity up in Norway. I mean, I'm hamming it up for effect. But in terms of the history, it's an interesting transition over half a century, and it maps onto a bunch of other, global problems. Climate change has the same chronology. Global health, in the new pandemics, the new epidemics has the same chronology. Various other types of politics, human rights, you could say, map onto this same chronology of a kind of globalism, a global concern that comes out of the 70s and manifests in large-scale corporate organization and funding by the 2000s. And that's what holds it in place. So it's a kind of consortium of consortiums of public-private partnerships that organize a vault for your seed samples.
Yeah, fascinating, because it's this global vision that is sort of so fundamentally liberalized in a way, in the sense that there's no communal sharing of these deposits, as you were saying. Every whoever deposits the seeds, I guess, maintains the ownership over their particular seeds. I guess that's a kind of contrast, I imagine, with the original Soviet seed bank and the kind of maybe communal vision they had of the future. But yeah, this does raise the question of the role played by agricultural corporations right now in terms of the seeds that they're producing, which are the product of genetic modification largely. And I'm curious, how are those seeds that are produced by these corporations relating to or crowding out the diversity of local seed varieties that have existed until now? I mean, there is, from what I can tell in reading about this, a whole legal regime and WTO trade rules that are all in place that are ostensibly designed to protect seed varieties, but in practice have kind of managed to privilege these corporate seeds. Is that right?
Yeah, there's a kind of basic dilemma here, right? And it goes back to kind of elementary school biology. Like seeds are magic. Right? They grow into plants, and what do the plants do? They make more seeds. And then quite often the plants put delicious fruit around the seeds so that animals eat them and then walk around and poop them out somewhere so that the plants spread, right? It's total magic. And that's the basis of farming. Like that's the basis of farming for the last 10,000 years, back to the Neolithic. Like Stone Age people figured out that you could actually do this in a reliable way. On the other hand, all of agricultural progress since the 19th century at least has consisted on increasingly moving away from that model, right? Because if what you did was to replant the products of your field, you have very little control over the development of productivity. And so from the 19th century, if not before then, certainly by the 20th century, almost all agricultural reforming projects consisted of sorting seeds, cleaning seeds, and in due course replacing the amateur seeds produced by farmers from their own crop with professional better seeds that they would buy or were given to them from the proceeds of the crop that they would sell, right? Because classic farmer always had the choice, how much of my crop do I retain for future growth and how much do I sell? What happens in the course of the 20th century is that reformers push farmers towards selling their entire crop and then buying new, high quality, reliable, standard seeds to plant the next year. So it's a cash-based model rather than a self-sufficiency. And what happened in that is that this became increasingly corporatized. As you'd imagine, you start with firms which are then in the business of selling these high-quality seeds. And then along come the 1980s, and some wise ass gets the idea that what we really ought to do is extend patent and IP law to the genetic knowledge inside these high profile, in these high reliability, high yield crops. And then the 1990s come along and you have the WTO and they decide, well, this is really cool stuff. You know, we ought to build international trade rules around this. And you're doing a negotiation, say, between North America and Mexico in the context of the first round of NAFTA. And American farming is saying, look, you know, Mexico may be the birthplace of maize, but we've now got all these new varietals which are more high producing. So we really would like to see these intruding into the Mexican market. And then the seed companies go to themselves, well, we're going to have rules about this because otherwise we'll have farmers taking one set of seeds, then growing the maize, and then going back to the old ways and planting and growing their own seeds. We can't have that. So we're going to have contracts saying they can't do it. And then you're going to get standardized international trade agreements which say, well, here, sign on the dotted line, ignore the fine print. But the fine print says, we own all of your IP. You have no right to reuse your own seeds. And if you do, we can sue your ass and you're going to be screwed, right? And then the EU comes along and says, well, we think that all trade agreements ought to have an agricultural seed protection clause in them. And a handy trade association, heavily backed by the fistful of seed firms there are in the world, offers you the already pre-formatted trade, a seed protection clause the Europeans know and like, and we're all good, right? And that's kind of the system that's developed. It doesn't require direct coercion most of the time. It's just a series of tracking of economically efficient and then legally enforced norms and then international trade treaties backing onto those. And the upshot is, and it's truly staggering, is that 4 companies control about 50% of the entire global market for seeds. And that and two of them are German. Like Bayer, BASF, they have the top and the bottom of the list. And then there's Corteva, which is one of these Latinate names which hides something else. So that's Dow DuPont, actually. And then there's Syngenta, which guess what is, the world's biggest Chinese agricultural corporate interest, registered in Switzerland with a name that you could, that could take out of a Latin textbook. But actually it's a Chinese agro-industrial complex. And they control 50% of the global seed supply. And woe betide you if you're a peasant somewhere in some invisible market they actually have some oversight over with some corporate interests, say India, and you violate what they take to be their IP rights. It's an extraordinary story.
Yeah, that does make sense. I mean, I guess by the time you get to the point of legal regulation, whether in the level of the EU or the WTO or wherever, I mean, that's going to privilege,
the big players,
corporations that are good at dealing with the paperwork. But I guess this does raise the question of, if these seeds that these four corporations that are left producing the global seed supply, I mean, if they are high quality seeds and they've made it their business to make sure they are high quality and they're genetically modifying them and improving those genetic modifications, to what extent should we be concerned about a loss of diversity? I mean, if this seed supply is secure, I mean, is seed diversity less important than it once was?
Yeah, I mean, it's quite a deal. Like, I mean, these companies, some of their seeds have special attributes like being resistant to the pesticides and herbicides sold, guess what, by the same company. So it's almost like a protection racket. Like, you use our chemicals, you're going to need our seeds. If you use our chemicals without our seeds, I can't guarantee you're going to, it's a little mafios. This question of diversity is really the alpha and omega of this. And there's really the scale of this question is gigantic. This is the sort of problem. This is why I'm so glad that we're doing this episode. This is huge, right? We think that the UNFAO thinks that 75% of the world's crop varieties disappeared between 1900 and 2000. So over 1 century of high intensity farming to feed a global population heading towards 8 billion plus, we lost 75% of the diversity of crops which humanity had hitherto relied on to survive. So if your hypothesis is right, Cam, that like these are great seeds, what's not to like? Let's go with the great seeds. Like, it's a huge gamble we're taking. Like, those better be the right seeds. And furthermore, no regret, right? We better not have lost some really good options in the 75% that we've discarded along the way, because if we had, that would be really tragic. And all of the experts agree that the opposite is the case of the contention, in your question. Like, everyone agrees that it's essential to maintain diversity, because when we say we're talking about genetic modification, hitherto at least, we're not making things up. We're taking traits which we recognize in strains which we've sequenced and saying, can we splice those with other things we recognize in other things that we sequenced and make cool things which combine the two things together? And it's also true that we don't really understand this well enough. So when unexpected, hitherto unknown pathogens or threats arise, we simply aren't competent to judge whether the sequences of DNA that we're preferring through this focus on the commercial crops actually contain within them the resistance capacities that we might need. And we just don't know that in advance. Our ability to do this is not that sophisticated. Furthermore, we don't know what all the risks might be that are out there, the challenges that our crops might face. And so there is an overwhelming mass of evidence saying that, no, on the contrary, in a sense, our capacity to do genetic modification actually makes it more important to retain the underlying set and maintain the underlying set of diversity that's out there. Because that's really ultimately our arsenal. That's the periodic table out of which we're going to make new things. And so, the damage that's already been done is disastrous. Fingers crossed, God help us, it isn't lethal. But everything that can be done at this stage to preserve variety is, we're spending a good deal more than we currently spend on those seed banks. Like, this is one of those things where I just kind of tear my hair out and go, what? We're only spending, how much are we spending on the biodiversity of our crop life? Like, you telling me this whole thing costs just like a couple of $10 million worldwide? Like, Is there somewhere where we could spend a couple of $10 billion maybe to make a real difference? Like, this is the sort of question I think we should be asking more aggressively. And of course, we shouldn't leave it to the private businesses, which might very well say to themselves, it's worth spending a couple of billion on this, because if we do, they are going to make the case, as they vigorously do, that all of that upfront investment and all of the research they do can only be justified if they're allowed to make profit. And for that, their IP must be protected. And we can't have peasants running around in their fields, home growing whatever, sophisticated varietal it is that we have spent huge amounts of money developing. And so probably the best way is to cut them out and to simply say, you know what, this is public research that should be done from public resources. Much of it already is anyway. Much of the life sciences that you rely on to generate your commercial profit now was entirely publicly funded. All of the basic research was. And so in some senses, we should cut out the middleman and just focus on expanding this as an area of publicly funded research, especially since it's really peanuts. It's tiny by comparison with the other things we spend money on. One Patriot battery, we're talking about rockets, like $1 billion for a rocket battery is like 20 times more than we spend on crop biodiversity, at least on the entire global seed bank system. Just one rocket system.
Yeah, and it's a good reminder. Once it's lost, we don't get it back, which makes all of this so important. But also a reminder that for anyone interested to hear more about seeds, do check out the other podcast that FP has produced, State of Seed. It's already out there live for anyone interested. But for now, we'll take a break and be back in a second to talk about the economics of Alaska. Hi, and welcome back. Our next data point is 1.3. That is the number of people per square mile in the state of Alaska. That's only 1.3 people per every square mile in the state. It is a vast state with a very small population, or relatively small population in U.S. terms. And it's now also the site of some high diplomacy happening, with Vladimir Putin, the president of Russia, meeting President Donald Trump for a high-stakes summit on the future of Ukraine. But we thought we would return to our intermittent series on U.S. states and the economies of them. Struck us as a good time to talk about Alaska, and I think it's a pretty interesting and insightful look at the U.S. and its history in Alaska. So, yeah, Adam, to start off with, we've talked about Alaska before. It's come up when we talked about transfers of land. We were talking about Trump's bid to buy Greenland, and then Alaska was a kind of precedent of buying territory, used to belong to Russia, was famously purchased by America in the 19th century. It's a kind of colonial transaction. And I'm curious, in what ways is Alaska still a kind of colony of the continental United States? I mean, I guess I'm asking that in economic terms. I mean, is it still legible as a colony? Is its economy structured around kind of extractive industries that we'd associate with colonialism? And I guess also along the same lines, what role does the U.S. military play in the Alaskan economy and in the growth of the Alaskan economy over time?
Yeah, I mean, it really was. I mean, insofar as we can talk, we can speak about, say, white people's settlement of Alaska. The native population goes back thousands of years, but it's always been a form of colonial settlement and a kind of extractive colonial settlement. This isn't really a settler colonial kind of project. And starting with the Russians, and they arrived in the 1740s. It was a classic fur trading outfit like the British and the French had in Canada. Sea otter pelts is what they were after. There were Orthodox missionaries there. And then Tsarist Russia suffered a defeat in the Crimean War against Britain and France, and went through the turmoil of the serfs' liberation in the 1860s and decided to sell it. I think that's the more, America bought it, but the real question is, why did Russia decide to sell it? And it was, on hard times. It was an expensive outpost, and they sold it in 1867. And in its initial decades, to come to the point about the military, it was really a military outpost. It was directly governed by federal authorities, by the Treasury, by the Navy. There's fishing there, there's salmon canneries, but then the real breakthrough is the gold discoveries, both in Alaska itself, in Juneau, which will then become the capital, which is down the Panhandle. Juneau, is the capital of Alaska. There's no road or rail connection to it. Then the Klondike Gold Rush, which is actually in Canada, but it spills over to Alaska in the 1890s. Copper discovered in 1900. So yes, exactly as you're saying, extractive, military garrisoned, outpost economy. And by World War II and in the early Cold War, overwhelmingly dominated by the military as residents, as workforce, as spending. All of those extractive industries didn't compare with the largesse of the US military as America turned itself into a global power. In the 1940s and 50s, Alaska assumed an entirely new significance. We think that in the aftermath of World War II, perhaps 40% of the population of Alaska was either directly in uniform or they were the families of people who were in uniform. So military spending, and it continues all the way down to the present days, greatly outsized as a share of the Alaskan economy. But then the real big breakthrough is the discovery on Cook Inlet of oil in 1957. There'd been earlier efforts to find it, but that was really the first major find. And that frames the decision for Alaska to go for and receive statehood in 1959, as recently as 1959. And then there's the great Prudhoe Bay discovery, massive oil field in 1968. And again, though, it depends on federal support. So the Trans-Alaska Pipeline System, without which those oil fields would not have been developed in the way they were, is a giant federal government, massive infrastructure project with federal government support and involvement. So yeah, it's an unusual instance, really, of that early heritage of the build out of the American nation state territory and its military extractive bare bones, very nakedly displayed in Alaska.
Yeah, you mentioned Alaska extracting oil, and that famously has been a big part of its economy. And I'm curious what role Alaska still plays in America's broader fossil fuel economy. I mean, now when we talk about American fossil fuels, we tend to think of natural gas and fracking. And I'm curious whether Alaska's oil has been overtaken by that fracked natural gas from elsewhere in the U.S.
It has, but I mean, this is a different beast. This is an epic, giant, classic oil field, right? This isn't the tight oil, all of this, difficult, unconventional stuff we're talking about with fracking, which in due course has been very productive. But I mean, I used to do work with BP, the British oil major, and they had a huge stake in Alaska. And for them, it was like this was this is an oil man's dream location. It's extraordinary kind of expanse of nature. And yeah, opening up Prudhoe Bay in 1968, it was Arco and Humble Oil, which later Exxon that really did this. They opened up what's called the North Slope. And when you hear oil people talk about this, it's a kind of dream scenario. It's like the desert, of the Gulf. It's the largest oil field that was ever found in North America. Initial proven reserves of 9.6 billion barrels. They ultimately have so far recovered 12 billion and counting. It is an absolute giant and hugely physically demanding, massive engineering challenge because a lot of it's in permafrost conditions. So this is like the great Siberian oil discoveries in the Soviet Union and Russia. This is extreme engineering. Then you have to build this pipeline. You're engaged in ultra complex politics with local government and with native communities. So it's a real test bed of the modern oil industry. I mean, it's opened up massively after 1973. So part of what makes this so important and exciting is that it's a bit like the North Sea discoveries as well. It comes after the first OPEC shock. And the oil companies, which had been so heavily invested in the Gulf, have to find new fields. And Alaska and the North Sea are where they go to do new style, high-tech Western oil drilling. By the late 1980s, it's the largest oil producer in the American system, 2 million barrels a day. So it's gigantic by any standards. It's also, of course, the turning point site for modern environmentalism when it comes to oil, because it's where Exxon Valdez ran aground in 1989. And this becomes, again, like a touchstone for the modern oil industry. There will, Exxon in particular commits as far as possible to ensuring nothing like this ever happens again. It was, dealing with these BP people 10 years later, you really felt the seriousness about that. And obviously they then suffered the absolutely ghastly, the worst ever Mexican disaster. But the stakes were incredibly high, the fragility of the environment, the drama of the environment, the complexity of the social background, the scale of the find, everything about this was epic. And I think it's easily, it's very far away from the rest of the United States. It's easily underestimated, but it was spectacular, and it demonstrated that the Western oil industry still had, some mojo. It wasn't just going to be a victim of Middle East politics. It was going to do new and extreme types of oil under its own steam. Yes, in due course, it has been eclipsed by fracking, but fracking is fracking is amateur. I mean, I'm exaggerating a little bit for effect, but it's very small scale stuff by comparison with the kind of engineering that had to be done in Alaska to make it work. In due course, it's become a huge player, and it is now eclipsing absolutely the Alaskan finds.
Yeah, I mean, the engineering challenge sounds impressive and kind of awe-inspiring in that setting of Alaska. But I can imagine it's also not inexpensive to kind of try to
huge investments.
Yeah. I mean, and just going forward, whether making those investments still makes sense, I imagine that's something these oil companies have to think about. But I do want to ask about one of the products of this oil economy, which is the permanent fund, as it's called in Alaska. It's essentially a kind of sovereign wealth fund that Alaska has, which accumulates money from oil revenues. And I'm curious whether the result of this is that Alaska is more socialist in some sense than other U.S. states, because this permanent fund does redistribute money famously to the Alaskan population. So how should we think about, the socialism at work in Alaska in this context?
Oh, I read your question. I was chuckling to myself. Socialism, Alaska. I don't want to. And then you look things up and you realize, in fact, there is a quite strong socialist tradition in the Pacific Northwest. There was a general strike in Seattle way back in the early 20th century, and in the fish canneries and in those kind of manufacturing sectors with, relatively high labor intensity. There was, in fact, IWW, the Wobblies were there, the Socialist Party was involved. But no, I mean, in the Cold War, any kind of element of leftism is pretty much shut down in Alaska. It's classic American unionism insofar as there is labor representation. And the idea for the fund, is launched by a Republican governor, Jay Hammond, who served between 74 and 82. And I think it's like I'm no expert on the history of this, but it reads like a classic example of public choice, economics deeply suspicious of democracy and what it'll do if it's given a giant windfall of resource. I mean, you've just found the largest oil field in the history of the United States as OPEC in Iran's crisis conspire to drive oil prices to utterly unheard of real levels. And so you, as a good American conservative in the 70s, go, we should not trust politicians anywhere near this. And what do you come up with? You come up with the idea of a sovereign wealth fund, which requires the reinvestment of at least 25% of the proceeds from oil. And like by this point, Alaska's state revenue is 85% oil, and it's booming on a huge scale. And so you put it in a wealth fund, and then a share of the dividend is paid out to Alaskan citizens in the form of a one-off payment. I mean, it's less socialism than something more like universal basic income. And it's known around the world, I think, as an example of a test case of universal basic income. And broadly speaking, economists love it because it's a great natural experiment, because no one in Alaska can really sensibly be said, poor people in Alaska can't sensibly be said to condition their life choices, whether to have babies, whether to invest in education, on intelligent forecasts of the future oil price. So as far as they're concerned, manna just rains from heaven to the tune of somewhere between $1,000 and $2,000 every year, depending on how much revenue is being generated and how much dividend is being earned. And so it's a really great way of testing various propositions about how people respond to sudden influxes of cash? And the answer is it's all good. It's basically really good for people. Poverty goes down. The worst effects of inequality are moderated. It does all of the good things you would expect, giving free handouts to the neediest in an unequal society would do. It actually just makes the world a better place. And so at that level, it's, quite a powerful demonstration of something we learned during COVID as well, which is that in a society like America, child poverty, abject want, multiple deprivation, absolute misery is a political choice. And if we don't want it, you just have to do basic cash handouts. And if you do those, it's not efficient necessarily. It's not going to optimize, but are you going to alleviate misery and suffering and social dysfunction? Absolutely. You are, and Alaska seems to show it.
You're certainly right that this sort of universal basic income is definitely the analogy here. And yeah, one hears this creeping back into public discourse with the growth of AI and the future of that. So yeah, Alaska is a kind of example of that policy that could be returning in some more widespread sense is something to consider. But I wanted to ask about Alaska's demographics. I mentioned at the outset the population density, but I want to ask more broadly about those demographics and how they influence the Alaskan economy and its society. And I'm thinking here specifically about the gender balance, or rather the unbalance between men and women in Alaska, and whether there is such an unbalance. I mean, I'm thinking about seasonal work, all of these kinds of extractivist industries that tend to also be associated with men and masculine or male migrant workers coming in, et cetera, for temporary periods of time. So yeah, how does that play out in Alaska in terms of its demographics?
Yeah, I mean, I feel a little tentative about talking about this because it's so easy to stereotype, and I've never been to Alaska. And I think the basic point is that modern Alaska is not a man camp, right? I mean, there have been phases in which Alaska has been a man camp, referring to the male-only enclaves that form around extractive industries worldwide, around gold, around oil, and so on. Today, it is simply the most unbalanced state of the US, and unbalanced in a strange way in that the population skews male rather than generally being the case, because women have higher survival rates, skewing female. So it's like, I think, 107 men for 100 women, something like that. We're not talking, so there's an imbalance, but it's not a man camp situation. There are parts of Alaska which still do resemble to a degree that kind of roughneck kind of model. And we did an episode about this, about fracking. It is true in Alaska as well, though I haven't seen work specifically demonstrating this as the way you can around the fracking industry. This is associated with higher rates of alcoholism. It's associated with higher rates of various types of violent crime and various types of sexual crime, spousal abuse, and so on, is more common in Alaska than across the United States as a whole. But I'm not going to and Native women, indigenous women are the most vulnerable groups. So this is like a statistical set of associations which confirm a certain set of stereotypes and a possible causality. There is an image of the rugged Alaskan man in the same way as I guess there's the image of the rugged Canadian Mountie or, the roughneck in American culture. So as in an oil derrick kind of guy. So, that may be part of it. If you look at the agenda of Alaskan politics, in principle, the politicians they elect in Washington are amongst the more reasonable, independent-minded members of the GOP. So this doesn't translate in any simple way, and they're women. So this doesn't translate in any simple and straightforward way, I don't think, into like a stereotypical image. But it's out there. It's definitely goes to your earlier question on what kind of a place is this. But you could say this was true of, this idea of it being part of a colonial settler, pioneering logic. There are many states in the United States, most prominently, of course, Texas, which, despite its huge urban expanses and very, very high levels of development, still remain attached to that idea of themselves. I mean, it's one of the things that really differentiates large parts of North America from Western Europe, right? There aren't a whole lot of Western Europeans who spontaneously self-identify with the pioneering outback kind of masculinity, right? It's not a big part of German. It's not a big part of German or French or Italian culture. Very, very present in the United States, and Alaska would be one further instance of that.
Yeah, I think the American sort of concept of wilderness is hard to find in Europe and in Germany. As much as Germany is interested in nature and has this kind of romantic relationships to nature, it doesn't quite translate into this concept of wilderness. And I guess
all the things that you need for it, right? No one in Germany buys a truck because they imagine they're going out into the wilderness. Like, that's not a thing, right?
Yeah, well, exactly. And and over time, they've also kind of, to some extent, eliminated their wilderness. I mean, it also doesn't exist. Where would one even go? But in some sense, this relates to the last question I wanted to ask, which is about the sheer scale of Alaska. Which, when I was a kid growing up in America, also we were always told that the scale of Alaska also was never quite properly represented in the maps we had of the country. And it was actually as large as half of the continental United States, this one state was. And I'm curious what kind of economic effect that scale has, and whether we could even or should be thinking of Alaska as a coherent economic entity as a whole, or is this, inherently a collection of disparate regions, unevenly developed, and ultimately kind of a pluralistic region, or is it a singular Alaska that we can talk about in economic terms?
No, it really isn't. I mean, the figure I have is that it's 1/5 the size of the continental United States. So it's 663,000 square miles and a population of 733,000 people, which is, 1/3 the size of Berlin. It's far less than live in Brooklyn. Like it's gigantic. And Juneau, the capital, literally doesn't have a road connection to anywhere, as far as I can see. You can only get there by airplane or boat, like the capital of the state. So no, it doesn't. And I mean, it's a little bit like that. For me, it was a discovery when we did the episode about Mark Carney and Canada and Trump. And, I discovered that, Canadian states trade more with their large southern neighbor, which is the United States, than they do with each other. And Alaska has a similar kind of geography, right? It's basically a tiny cluster, relatively speaking, tiny urban cluster, Anchorage and its associated areas, Fairbanks, and then Juneau, and that's it. And then there's just this huge, immense hinterland full of huge resources. And this has inspired at various points a kind of native economic. I mean, just pause and think about it for a second. This is a giant natural resource at the level of the sort of resources we've spoken about, the Emirates or Qatar or somewhere like that, right? With 700,000 people, 15% of which are indigenous. They're just moderately better off than the rest of the United States, and they have this sovereign wealth fund. Like, if they own the oil companies, if Exxon wasn't Exxon but was Alaskan Oil, like, imagine how wealthy they'd be. Like, if this was not simply, another part of the United States in which giant American companies operate, but an Alaska for Alaskans unit, it would be entirely different politics, right? An entirely different economic setup. But that's exactly what it wasn't. This was not the oil that got expropriated. This was not the oil that got taken out of Western hands in 1973. And this is where the oil majors came to play. And so they of course, wages are very high in Anchorage. People got prosperous off the back of this, but it didn't become the foundation of a sovereign, enormously wealthy Gulf-style petrostate.
Or you're envisioning Alaska as a potential Norway, say, if it were.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, it's exactly precisely like a Norway. It would have those kind of ratios. That's a Norway or a Qatar, one of them.
Which itself is a spectrum.
Imagine if the strong analogy would be like, imagine if the indigenous population, the 15%, which is about 100,000 people, said it's ours.
Yeah.
It's ours. It's just full stop ours. So then you get into Qatari ratios.
Yeah, the Qatari Sarah Palin, I'm trying to imagine. But
that should be the title of this episode.
Mm-hmm. In any case, there will be, Qataris and Norwegians aside, be Russians visiting this weekend. We'll obviously be watching what happens, but maybe we'll talk about the results of that summit next week. But in the meantime, we'll say goodbye for now. And as always, be back in a week from now. Ones and Tooze is written and edited by Adam and me and produced by Claudia Tatey. The show is made possible through the support of foreign policy readers and Ones and Tooze listeners. As always, we love getting listener feedback. You can leave voice messages on the Ones and Tooze homepage on foreignpolicy.com or email us. That's podcast@foreignpolicy.com. Or you can tweet us. That's @onesandtwospod. I'm Cameron Abadi. Thank you very much for listening, and we'll be back in your feed next week.